Well, I'm delighted to say that I am joined once again by the directors of WOLFWALKERS. We have here Ross Stewart and Tomm Moore. I just wanted to start off by, first of all, congratulating you on what is a really incredible piece of work. And clearly, a lot of people have put their work into that film, and it's a real labour of love. I'm just interested to start off with, just to explore with you whether you knew at the start of this process, when you directed Secret of Kells and Song of the Sea, whether you were going to be making a trilogy at that point, because I've heard it referred to as a sort of final part of your Irish folklore trilogy, if you like.
I think it kind of evolved. I mean, when we were making Secret of Kells, we had no idea if we'd ever get another bite of the apple. And certainly around the time we were working on Song of the Sea, I felt it would be good to have a three-parter, like the nice DVD box sets behind you. I used to dream of having a 3 DVD box set at the end. And Ross and I actually dreamed up the idea for WOLFWALKERS right at the beginning of Song of the Sea. But even then we knew it would be an opportunity to kind of pack in everything we'd learned from the previous movies that we were working on and try and sort of sign off with a flourish so that we could focus on other things and go in different directions perhaps afterward.
Yeah, because like the animated features that we're making, especially in Cartoon Saloon, they take such a long time. You wouldn't want to be doing the same thing over and over for too many years. So after this, Tomm and myself will go off and be able to explore all kinds of other avenues. We won't be locked into the same style or the same format.
Yeah, even if we came back to folklore, I think it would be different. And even if another director in Cartoon Saloon wanted to work with Irish history and folklore, it would be different because these are all of a piece, design-wise, musically, themes in the writing and story. Everything is sort of a continuation of a collaboration that began back with Secret of Kells, and we sort of wanted to put a pin on that one.
And a lot of research goes into a film like WOLFWALKERS, not just the historical research, which we'll come on to in a moment, but also obviously geographical research. And I know that like when Disney made Moana, they all had trips over to the Polynesian islands, and Pixar, when they're making a film, they have some big trip somewhere. But you actually made a film set in Kilkenny.
Yeah, so we didn't have to go too far to get the inspiration. But it was really handy because a lot of the team that worked on WOLFWALKERS aren't from Kilkenny or Ireland, or some of them aren't from Europe. So when they come over, they have they don't necessarily know what an Irish forest looks like. So we used to take a lot of trips out to the forest and get some location designs drawn there. And then we were lucky enough in our first studio that you could literally look out the windows and see Kilkenny Castle, see the chimneys and the rooftops that Robyn jumps around as on a wolf. So it was literally at our doorstep. So they could just draw inspiration from looking out the window. It's handy.
And in terms of the design, obviously we see the color palette, those really kind of rich, like red and greens and golds. And how much did you allow that to kind of affect the direction in terms of the look of the piece?
Well, I mean, we kind of knew that our overall color scheme was going to have orange as a huge theme, like Meabh's orange hair. And then setting it in autumn with the orange leaves, that would be like the main color palette of the forest. Unfortunately, in Ireland, the UK, we don't get like the really strong, vibrant colors in autumn that say they might have over in North America. So we did have to allow for a little bit of artistic license and cheat it a little bit with that. But the main color scheme would be like really saturated autumnal colors in contrast to the really dull, muted colors of the town.
And can you just tell us a little bit about the process in terms of when you're first of all designing the characters, because moving something from the script onto the screen obviously is a big process, and whether that is something. So I'm guessing that I know you've worked again with the same writer, Will Collins, who did Song of the Sea, but I guess as you're making the film, the script is evolving all the time, and how the characters, whether you had the characters when you first came up with the idea, or whether that's something that works through the process.
Yeah, we had our first idea actually had a lot of the same characters, even if we didn't have the final plot worked out. But the biggest thing was that certainly for me, and I'm sure Ross as well, it's integral to how we imagine the movie by drawing the characters. We draw the characters as we're writing, as we're working out the script, and the design that we have in mind is there right from the beginning. But in the writing process, Robyn went from being a little boy character to a little girl character, and that was interesting because it was something we resisted at first, and then once we realized that it made so much more sense from a story point of view, that this would be a little girl in this situation, and it would be a little bit different than what we've done in the past, it kind of clicked into place. And once we drew that design for Robyn and kind of felt, it came pretty quickly. We felt she was who we'd been writing all along, and we had kind of gotten the gender wrong for a while, and it all clicked into place so much more. So everything was being written and designed at the same time during that first development process with Will. Even when we were designing the character of Robyn's dad, Bill Goodfellow, we were imagining Sean Bean. We were watching Game of Thrones at the time, and we were doing little bad impersonations of him and stuff. So he was kind of in our minds, and we were lucky then that he actually accepted the role later, because it would have been bad otherwise.
And in terms of the sort of the historical accuracy of the piece, obviously you have to take certain liberties with what you're given, but presumably you still had to do a lot of research in terms of what people were wearing in the 17th century, what the look of the towns and so forth would look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's pretty hard to find a lot of accurate historical representations of Irish towns in the 1600s, because I suppose there wasn't a whole lot of woodcuts being done representing it, but we were able to draw on the available woodcut illustrations of other towns around that time and like written documents about it. But we took some liberties, all right. I mean, it's, I suppose it's part of an animated feature that the story and visuals come first, and the historical reference is a little bit.
But what was really exciting was I thought the clothes were cool. I remember we were looking at The Witch and The Piano and other kind of movies with these Puritan characters. That was really inspiring. And also the fact that a lot of what we were looking at as reference from that time period were these woodblock prints that were made at the time. And that actually informed how we even drew and painted the backgrounds and the characters in the town. We wanted to create a woodblock print effect. So not just the costumes and the way the houses were built and all that, but also just how they were represented at the time ended up on screen through that research.
And one thing that's really clear is how cinematic this film really is, in terms of everything from the sort of the editing and the montage work through to the sort of split screen, the wolf's eye view. Everything has been really thought through using sort of cinematic language.
Yeah, and also we were kind of pushing against conventional cinematic language to try and use the language of comic books and illustration, and use the fact that it was hand-drawn, that we could play with aspect ratios very easily, almost like a comic book panel. We could have scratchy lines all around the character in the border if they're feeling trapped, and all those kind of tricks that you don't normally see in feature animation, maybe more so in short animation. We were trying to bring that into the cinematic language of the film, so that we weren't mimicking live action or doing something that could be done in stop motion or CG. Just doing something that was really speaking to the fact that this was hand-drawn.
And obviously, you're talking then about using some quite experimental film techniques. And I just wonder, obviously, the 2D animation now, in terms of the big studios, particularly in the US, everything now is about computer-generated animation, and that is the sort of the leaders. But actually, in Japan and France, 2D animation is still incredibly strong. Did you have any resistance from the fact that you are continuing to work in 2D hand-drawn animation?
No, I think Cartoon Saloon has kind of carved out a niche of quality 2D animation. And while the bigger studios have gone down the CG route, as you say, in other countries and other territories, 2D is still seen as just as valid. And I think what we were trying to do by using 2D is to see what 2D allows us to do that CG can't do. Like bringing in like what we're doing with the line work on the characters. The fact that the line work can convey how the characters are feeling, or the emotive aspects of the scene. Split screens and rough borders that are animated, and even the whole wolf vision scenes. I think there's a quality in there that CG would find it harder to try and mimic, whereas in 2D it's natural.
I think that because we were inspired by projects like The Tale of Princess Kaguya from Ghibli, all our references when we first approached our partners were not just previous Cartoon Saloon films, but the cutting edge of hand-drawn that was still happening in Japan and Europe. So I think we were lucky. All our partners were on board for what we were trying to do, and they understood that this was kind of an evolution of a hand-drawn style that we'd started with Secret of Kells.
And were there any particular sequences or characters that that kind of gave you particular challenges that you had to deal with during the shoot?
Well, the wolves, I think, because we wanted the wolves to be so energetic and so fluid, that doing a model sheet for a character, it's necessarily rigid. You know, you have to show it from all angles, and so it becomes a little bit robotic. But then when we're trying to animate it, we want it to be as flowy and liquidy as possible. So you kind of have to kick back against what you're given on the model sheet. And then like also the cleanup, you know, the line thickness and the scribbly and live, you know, kind of organic texture to it. It's kind of hard to get every artist to be on the same page as that, because every artist draws in a different way. So, you know, that would have been one of the challenges.
But I think at the beginning, the kind of task we set ourselves was that every artist in every department would be very much an artist and never fall into just being a technician. That can often happen in a big production. So we tried to keep everyone engaged in the story they were telling. So if you were a final line animator, cleanup animator, you were thinking about what the character was going through. If you were an ink and paint artist, you weren't just filling in the colors, you were also thinking about how to use the colors in a way that showed that woodblock style or helped with the movement by offsetting the colors in a certain way. So everybody in every department had to sort of switch their art brain on and not switch off and just become technicians filling in the lines.
And you touched on the design with the wolf and the pack and so forth. Did that require a lot of research in terms of watching programs about wolves or going and looking at wolves in the wild?
The start of the whole project was a documentary called Wolfland that we saw on Irish TV. And really at the beginning, it was about how wolves were so prevalent in Ireland, but unfortunately they're not anymore. Like the story talks about the beginning of the end of the wolves in Ireland. So it wasn't that easy to meet a real life wolf. We had dogs and stuff around the studio.
Yeah, like even it's the same in the UK and in Ireland. Like the wolves only exist in wildlife parks and zoos. So, you know, it's not like say in France and Germany where they actually have these wolves living in the forest. And I don't think we understand as a society the kind of like the fact of this megafauna existing just outside our cities. We weren't able to go and like, you know, draw them in person. But there was a lot of research done into it. We had like master classes with animators, you know, about how quadrupeds move and about like, you know, the facial structure, the skeletal structure of wolves. And, you know, a lot of research went into that too. But yeah, unfortunately, we can't go outside and just draw the nearest pack.
And there's a number of really strong kind of themes that emerge through the film that are not done in a kind of worthy way. They're absolutely kind of an integral part of the story. And I'm talking about sort of obviously, you know, the environment is very key. The kind of idea about people being scared of difference, and also, in fact, you know, colonization and sort of the whole colonial kind of approach. I wonder if you just talk a little bit about that and how they became sort of like emerging themes.
Well, at the very core of the story, Ross and I wanted to deal with some of these issues that concerned us. And, you know, we're both very involved in environmentalism. We're both vegetarian. We both, you know, think about these issues a lot, and we wanted to deal with them. And sadly, I mean, what's kind of depressing is how relevant they continue to be 7 years later. I remember showing a work in progress a couple of years ago when Australia was experiencing terrible fires to our composer, and he was kind of quite moved by the scenes that we have of the forests being destroyed, and because that was all over the news. And now sadly it's continuing at the moment. And so those themes were things we wanted to speak to, but on a subtextual level, a sort of as a backdrop. And we always wanted to put to the fore the theme of the two girls. Is that, I mean, that's where the healing can come. Like, we can preach about what's going on in the environment, but only if we can kind of come across the divide, the polarization that we're facing. And it was interesting because we looked at that time in history, and that was like the ultimate polarization. It was really a culture clash of two civilizations. And the idea that Robyn, coming over from England with her dad as part of the colonizing army, trying to wipe out the wolves, could make friends with Meabh, who is the last of a kind of pagan, indigenous Irish population that is effectively gone, and that they could make friends so easily, and they could see the world through each other's eyes and help each other out with some kind of hopefulness, I hope, in regards to all those heavier themes that we were thinking about.
And also learning to live with the other, whether the other is an enemy that you thought existed in human or in animal form. There has to be some kind of compromise. There has to be a meeting in the middle like that, you know. And so if there are wolves in the forest, you know, maybe you leave a wild space for them and you live over here, and you know, you can coexist in the same place. And then the same thing with Robyn and Meabh, that they understand their differences. They're still separate little, you know, children, but they're able to be friends. They're able to find some kind of compromise and meet in the middle and coexist.
And you touched on Bruno Coulet, who has composed another of his extraordinary scores for the film. And I wonder, obviously there are different composers who have different approaches to working in film. Sometimes they work alongside the filmmaker throughout the duration. Sometimes they come in at the very end when the film is made. How was the collaboration with Bruno?
Well, over the years, we've worked with Bruno in different ways. On Song of the Sea, it was like, because it was such a musical project, he was involved even as we were writing the script. On this project, we knew we wanted to work with him and the band Keela, again, because that was a really great collaboration on the previous two, and it helped, you know, make the film feel of a piece with the previous two. But this time, Bruno kind of sent us demos as we were working at different points, and we met him early on with the band Keela and discussed the movie and what we had in mind. And there would be certain sequences that we'd ask him for a pretty clear demo early on so that we could animate with that in mind. And there was other places that it was more just a process of back and forth, him suggesting something, trying something out over the course of the production.
Yeah, for me, the most interesting part was the way that Bruno worked, in that when he was composing the pieces for orchestra, it was very planned out. You know, you had to think about every single section of the orchestra, and it was all planned out and everything. And then he allowed for this organic space working with Keela, where they could just, over the course of a couple of days in the recording studio, kind of jam and kind of just like get in some really energetic, chaotic pieces. And it was so you had like a almost like the themes of the movie, you know, that you had this order and control, and then you had this chaos and instinct and just like organic beauty. It was really beautiful the way that it matched up.
You talked about Sean Bean, and he is one of a number of very talented actors in the project. Obviously, he and Maria Doyle Kennedy are very experienced and known. But obviously, the two child roles, the roles of Meabh and Robyn, are so crucial to get right because so much hangs on them. And can you tell us about where you found them?
Well, Honor is a professional actress, has been in quite a few pieces, especially over in the UK. She was a professional, and I think when we saw her tape and the casting demos, it was very obvious. She even looked a little bit like the Robyn character, you know. She had that mannerism and everything. So she was a dead cert from the beginning. With Eva had acted just in school and amateur dramatics before, and it was a chance to take, you know, well, you would take a chance on someone who hadn't done professional work before, but her casting demo reel was just so good. It had so much energy and so much enthusiasm, and she was just this little ball of like spirit, and just had a real enthusiasm that fitted into Meabh. So I think we had to kind of maybe hope that she could reach the depths, the sadness and tears, and then be able to roar and take direction that way. But she rose to the challenge. She's like a super little actress, all right. And now she's working on one of the next projects at Cartoon Saloon as well.
What was nice about Eva, I suppose, was just how she evolved from when we first met her. She was very pure natural talent. And by the time we did the final recording with Sean Bean and everyone, she was on it. She knew her lines off by heart. She could give us different versions of every take. So it's always a pleasure for me. It's the third time that I've had to go out and look for a kid that probably wasn't born when I started writing the project, and hope that somebody has been born in the meantime that can play the part. And I've been so lucky 3 times in a row, and I wonder if I shouldn't chance my arm again. But the fact that Eva was just 8 years old when we found her and she was absolutely right for the role was really special.
And were they all able to record together, or did they record their parts individually?
Yeah, thankfully they were, mostly all the actors were together. Definitely the main four, like Simon McBurney and Sean Bean were able to play against each other. Eva and Honor did a few sessions together, 2 or 3 sessions together, and that was really vital to the kind of natural dynamic we needed between the 2 girls.
And Ross, your credit on previous Cartoon Saloon films has mainly been around kind of art direction. For those people who are not in the know, what is the main difference between being an art director and a director?
So when I was art director on Secret of Kells, I just had to take care of the art, and I didn't have to go into lots of meetings about like you know, music and production, and it was less stressful anyway because I only had to take care of the visuals of the film. But I think being a director, you have to have such an overview of the story and how it affects every single department. And that's the real challenge, I think. You know, like anytime you compartmentalize and go into another department, you only need to look after a certain remit. You know, it's a smaller gamut of responsibility. But I think when Tomm and myself were directing every single department, we had to take into account what it means to the story all the time.
And towards the end of making the film, obviously there's been this big kind of global pandemic moment, which is still with us as we record this. And I wonder if you could just tell us what point you were in the production when that happened, and how you've been able to kind of react to that, if you've had to, in terms of the finishing off and dealing with things remotely and so forth.
We were lucky enough that Ross just spoke to that really creative process that can really only happen when everyone's in the studio together, that we did with the musicians from Keela and with Bruno. And we managed to do that just like a week or two before the lockdown. And then we had to move to work from home very quickly, which was scary for everyone. But at least it was a big group of old friends, and we've been through it together before, and we all kind of knew each other and each other's strengths and weaknesses. So we managed to pull it off, and we were mostly focused on finishing some effects, some of the final drawing, and all the finalizing the coloring and the final compositing of the image. So that went relatively smoothly. Thankfully, animation can continue even if we're all just on Zoom or whatever like this. And maybe better than I would have anticipated. It wouldn't be how I choose to make a movie, but it definitely worked out better than I might have imagined. Maybe the last part that was a bit unfortunate was recording Aurora's song. We'd been working with Aurora from very early on, hoping to get a moment where we could record with her. And she'd been planned to come to Dublin the week of the lockdown. And so she had to record from Norway over Zoom, but it all worked out perfectly, so thankfully.
I think it would have been much harder if it had been in pre-production, you know, where you need a group of people brainstorming and throwing ideas across the table, like, you know, in real time. It's harder to do that in a Zoom call.
Well, I think on that basis, just need to say a huge congratulations to you both. I know the film is going to have a theatrical moment both in the UK and Ireland coming up, and then it's going to be screened on Apple TV. But big congratulations, and I wish you every success with the release.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.